Welcome back. You're still watching NEDBANK Business Watch. Thank you so much for staying with us. Eswatini recently played host to senior policymakers, economic experts and development leaders at the ad hoc expert group meeting and the 31st Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts for Southern Africa. At the heart of these discussions was a central question. And the question is, how does Southern Africa unlock industrial growth? How does it deepen regional integration and fully harness the promise of the African Continental Free Trade Area? To help us unpack the outcomes as well as the road ahead, we are joined by Eunice G, Kamwendo, the Director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Subregional Office for Southern Africa. She's a key voice in shaping policy that guides industrialization as well as economic transformation across the region. Kamwendo, welcome to NEDBANK Business Watch. A very good afternoon to you. How are you?
Thank you, and good afternoon. I am well, thank you.
Fantastic. Perhaps let's start with the key outcomes, right? And I want to understand this from your vantage point. What were the most significant insights as well as the outcomes that emerged from the ad hoc expert group meeting as well as the 31st Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts that was held here in Eswatini?
Indeed. No, thank you very much again, Sifiso. So just to perhaps start by introducing what those two meetings are, I think it's important for the viewers to know this. They're actually our statutory meetings that we hold every year. And basically what we do is convene member states within the sub-region. We present our program of work, what we've done for that year, but most importantly, what we intend to do the next year. And typically, this conversation is really built around what are the key pressing issues that the region is facing, that the region should focus on with our support. Again, to give it context, last year we had the same conversation in Zambia, which was hosted in Zambia. And the topic of discussion was to deal with the energy deficits that we're having in the region. You might remember this, a lot of the rolling blackouts in South Africa, for example, 21-hour blackouts in Zambia where we're hosted, and similar stories from other countries within the region. And that was pressing because indeed, if you're talking about industrialization, you cannot talk about industrialization without energy because it is a key enabler. So you would see that what we typically do is really center the conversation on the key critical issues within the sub-region. And happy to report, therefore, that we're seeing a lot of advances within the region in terms of investments in energy diversification and so on. This year's conversation was around AFCFTA. Again, was also very deliberate because if you recall that we started the year with the US, for example, imposing tariffs worldwide on a number of countries, and including Southern Africa, and that has had a huge negative impacts on economies of the sub-region. And the reason why we're having this conversation was, one, to literally deal with that critical issue head on and make sure that Southern African countries are more resilient, are building economic resilience in this sense. So if I drill it down back to a few takeaways from that conversation was, one, the realization or recommitment by member states noting that AFCFTA will be or is a game changer for the sub-region, remains a game changer if you look at, and we talk about this a lot, the 1.4 billion market that we have at our disposal. The second takeaway was around, fine, we do have AFCFTA as a game changer, but do we have the products that we can trade amongst ourselves? And the reality is that not really, because if you look at the economies of Southern African region, it's really commodity-based, focused on a few products, maybe mineral for some and a few others for others, but not wide enough to be able to trade on the CFTA market. So therefore, the second takeaway was let us build regional value chains so that we can take advantage of the AFCFTA and ensure that our economies are therefore resilient. And thirdly, and I'll stop here, was also the fact that yes, we can build products, we can trade, but one of the Achilles heel that we have in international trade is that there are also a lot of non-tariff barriers that countries actually impose on each other. And therefore, this was a very good platform to have that conversation to remove those non-tariff barriers for us to be able to take advantage of the AFCFTA. So three key takeaways from where I stand.
And you do mention something quite critical there, the 1.5 billion market within the AFCFTA that we do want to leverage. It is in our disposal anyway. But you know, the conversation around value chains is also quite critical. And one wants to understand practical steps, you know, that Southern Africa can really take to build and benefit more effectively from those value chains, you know, as a pathway to stronger industrial development. How can we really do that in terms of, you know, building and benefiting more into those value chains?
Indeed. So one of the functions that we have as ECA is we generate knowledge. So we're a think tank as an organization, but we also convene. So part of the meeting that we had was the second function that we have in terms of convening, and then third one is around providing technical assistance. Now, value chains, I think a good starting point, and perhaps here, let me come with one of the challenging issues that the Minister of Finance of Eswatini actually raised to me 2 years ago when I had come. We had come to launch the Eswatini's national AFCFTA implementation strategy. And he said to me, as a Minister of Finance, I'm looking at the import bill, and we import almost everything. It means that we're not producing much. Can you help us identify some of the critical areas that we can actually begin to develop in terms of value addition or developing a regional value chain? Which I think is very, very critical. And a lot of the countries, Eswatini is not alone in that dilemma, because if you look across the sub-region, a lot of countries are in the same spot. So for us, what we have done in terms of ECA Southern Africa is really to ensure that we are putting front and center the issue of developing regional value chains. And I'll mention, there are a few that we're doing within the region, but I want to mention one because that one will link not just one country, but several other countries within the sub-region. Now, if you look at the beef sector, for example, we do have Botswana, which exports beef to Europe, for example. And for them, their concentration is a lot more just on the beef, not so much on beef products. So when we started this conversation again 2 years ago with the Botswana government, one, we want, of course, for them to expand beyond what they're producing in terms of beef, but we also wanted to use or leverage their position that they already captured the market to see what else they could produce. So leather products, for example, is one. And once you bring in that as a value chain to say leather products, then automatically you bring in other countries like South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, Eswatini, Zambia, Zimbabwe, where they actually have huge numbers of livestock. So the leather value chain is actually quite wide, where they can, you know, industries can actually begin in terms of whether it's making shoes, making bags, belts. But I think for me also more critically, the leather industry is actually one which is key, because if you look at South Africa, they already have a very well-developed automotive industry, and they actually need leather for the car seats. Already, you can already see you're moving up the value chain. So for us, I think that's a practical example on how we can build industries. And I can speak on a few others that are in the similar category. But the idea is that we're able to pull in the regional assets into what should be both at a national level, but also at a regional level, that we can build industries, but also make sure that we are manufacturing, but at the same time ensuring that we are achieving economic diversification.
And, the private sector, I do want to understand, how does the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa see the private sector shaping and accelerating the continent's industrial drive?
So the private sector, and I think this, the jury has already been out on this one. I think we all know this. We talk about it and we sing about it to say the private sector is the one that would drive growth, would drive industrialization, would drive economic diversification. And there are a lot of examples from a lot of the developed, but also emerging countries that have actually used the private sector a lot more to drive their industrialization. So I think on that issue is settled. How do we support? So for us, because recognizing that, we ensure that we support private sector to thrive and develop. As you recall in my introduction, when I said some of the key functions that we work on, but just to come back and say also for ECA, we work a lot at the policy level. And it is important to work at the policy level to ensure that private sector is supported, because that is also, if governments do not create the enabling environment in terms of policies or supportive infrastructure, as well as some of the incentives, then private sector wouldn't be able to thrive. So first of all, as ECA, we work at a policy level, ensuring that countries are looking at their policy environments that will enable private sector to thrive. But we also, beyond working at the policy level, which, yes, is important, we've increasingly also begun to work directly with the private sector, because I think there's a lot in terms of, and we're doing this not only ourselves, but with also other collaborating partners. An example would be the United Nations Development Programme, the UN UNCTAD, for example, and other UN agencies, as well as other private sector. So what we are doing is basically working directly with private sector. Of course, private sector, there are different levels. There are some that are ready to fly. There are some that are just beginning to develop their products. So working with private sector, especially small and medium type of enterprises, supporting them in developing their products, supporting them in ensuring that whatever product that they're developing meets the standards that can be traded across borders, supporting them into branding, as well as finding the markets, is an area that we've started working very closely around. And you can see from that perspective that we actually also, from our perspective, working across the entire value chain policy, but also directly with private sector to ensure that they can actually grow, thrive, and trade under AfCFTA or other free trade agreements that we already have, like SADC and COMESA.
Yeah, and in what ways do you support the countries in addressing non-tariff barriers, but also improving customs and trade facilitation and aligning, the regulatory frameworks that are there to fully unlock the benefits of the African continental free trade area?
So for us as ECA, we work, like I said, at continental, regional, but also country level. But what we do, and what we do best, which we felt it's working really well, is to work very closely with regional economic communities. I mentioned before the SADC Secretariat as one, the COMESA Secretariat as another. I think leveraging those platforms, first of all, is important because a lot of these issues are regional based, although there can be disputes at a bilateral level between countries. I think we always have to bring the conversation back to the regional economic communities as one. Secondly, I think one of our key areas of work is also to advocate for certain issues. And the more we talk about critical issues within the sub-region, but also at continental level, we've also seen how that has helped a lot. But thirdly, if I bring it back to the conversation that we had in Eswatini last week, we were able to see countries, for example, member states that were represented there. An example was Eswatini raising a challenge that they have as a non-tariff barrier that they have with Zimbabwe. You know, they've imposed an non-tariff barrier for them. And I guess for Zimbabwe, it's a protectionist angle. So we started the conversation, but at the same time, we will take it up to the appropriate channels in terms of the SADC Secretariat as well as COMESA to ensure that we help these two countries resolve some of the challenges that they're having. And there's so many other examples that are alike that countries also came forward to say they're having a challenge with either Botswana or another because they're, bringing all these non-tariff barriers, which is actually going against the free trade agreements that, exist within the sub-region. So again, working closely with those regional economic communities helps a lot, advocating, but also providing the platform that countries can actually come and, for a lack of a better word, expose some of the malpractices that are happening between countries. I think it's a useful way also to deal with these issues.
Eunice, thank you so much for your insights and for joining us here on NEDBANK Business Watch. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Conversation with Eunice G. Kamwendo, the Director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the Subregional Office for Southern Africa, which is walking us through the outcomes from the meetings here in Eswatini, as well as the broader economic mission to build a resilient, integrated, industrial and competitive Africa. Thank you for staying with us. You're still watching NEDBANK Business Watch. The show continues after the break.
Welcome back now for the final segment of the show, which is the market analysis. Kamwendo, who is the